The studio lights dimmed as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett walked onto the late-night talk show set, emerald green blazer, sharp against the dark backdrop. Just moments before, host Bill Maher made a comment that sent shockwaves through the audience. A remark about urban politicians playing the race card that many saw as a direct attack on black representatives like Crockett. The 33-year-old Texas Democrat had been invited to discuss criminal justice reform. But what happened next would turn a routine political interview, a viral moment that dominated social media for weeks. Maher, known for his provocative style and decades of controversial takes, thought he could easily handle another young politician. He was wrong. What Crockett did in the following 20 minutes didn't just surprise Maher, it left him visibly shaken, scrambling for responses and facing the biggest backlash of his career. This wasn't just a political disagreement. This was a masterclass in how to dismantle someone who underestimated their opponent. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these incredible political moments that everyone will be talking about tomorrow. Bill Maher sat behind his familiar desk, the same spot where he'd hosted politicians, celebrities, intellectuals for over 2 decades. At 68, the comedian turned political commentator had built his reputation on saying what others wouldn't dare. His show had become a weekly destination for political junkies, known for its panel discussions and Maher's often controversial monologues. Maher prided himself on being politically incorrect, often claiming he spoke truth to power regardless of who got offended. He'd survived multiple scandals, lost shows, and bounced back stronger. His audience loved his willingness to challenge both sides of the political spectrum, though critics often accused him of crossing lines, particularly when discussing race and social issues. Tonight he'd planned what seemed like a standard segment on criminal justice reform. He'd done hundreds of these interviews with politicians. In his mind, this would be another opportunity to showcase his sharp wit against a relatively new congresswoman who'd probably stick to talking points. Jasmine Crockett represented Texas's 30th congressional district, but her influence extended far beyond Dallas. At 33, she'd already established herself as one of the most articulate and fearless voices in Congress. A former public defender and civil rights lawyer, she'd fought in courtrooms long before stepping in political arenas. Crockett had grown up understanding the justice system from both sides, seeing how it failed communities of color while also knowing exactly how to use legal arguments to fight back. Her background wasn't just political theory. It was lived experience defending people who others had written off. She'd come to the show expecting a serious discussion about prison reform and police accountability. What she didn't expect was Maher's opening comment that would change the entire tone of the evening. But Crockett had faced hostile judges, aggressive prosecutors, and dismissive colleagues her entire career. She wasn't intimidated by a talk show host. This confrontation represented more than just two people disagreeing. Maher embodied a certain type of liberal comedian, believed his progressive credentials gave him permission to make comments about race that others couldn't. Crockett represented a new generation of black political leaders who refused to let such remarks slide, even from supposed allies. The audience watching included millions of Americans grappling with ongoing conversations about racism, whether it could hide behind humor, and who gets to decide what crosses the line. This wasn't just entertainment, it was a real-time example of how these crucial conversations play out in public spaces. For Maher, this was supposed to be another episode. For Crockett, it became an opportunity to address something much bigger than one person's comment. The winner of this exchange would shape how similar conversations happen in the future. The trouble started during Maher's opening monologue, before Crockett even appeared. While discussing recent political developments, Maher had veered into commentary about urban politicians. "You know what I love about these young representatives from urban districts," he said with his trademark smirk. "They figured out the perfect political strategy. Just call everything racist and watch your opponents scramble. The audience gave uncertain laughter, some clapping while others remained silent. Maher continued, "It's like having a trump card you can play anytime someone disagrees with your policies. Can't defend your position on crime racism, someone questions your budget proposals. Obviously racist. It's brilliant. Really behind the scenes." Crockett's team immediately recognized the problem. Her communications director whispered urgently into his phone while her chief of staff pulled up clips on his tablet. They knew this wasn't just a casual comment. It was a talking point that had been used to dismiss black politicians for decades. When Maher introduced Crockett, his tone carried an undertone that regular viewers would recognize. "Joining me now is Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas, who I'm sure will have some very strong opinions about criminal justice reform," he said, emphasizing the words in a way that suggested he expected her to prove his earlier point. Crockett walked out with a professional smile, but those who knew her could see the steel in her eyes. She'd heard the opening monologue from the green room, she'd seen her staff's concerned faces, and she'd made a decision about how this interview would go. As she settled into the guest chair, Maher leaned back with the confidence of someone who'd done this dance thousands of times. "Congresswoman, thanks for joining us. I was just talking about how young politicians from urban areas approach political discourse these days. What's your take on that?" The question seemed innocent enough. Crockett recognized it immediately as a trap. Answer defensively, and she'd be proving his point. Ignore it, and she'd be letting a harmful stereotype stand unchallenged on national television. "Well, Bill," Crockett began, her voice steady and measured, "I think it's interesting that you'd characterize political discourse from urban areas in that way. Can you be more specific about what you mean by that?" Maher shifted slightly, perhaps sensing this wasn't going to be as easy as he'd expected. "Just mean that sometimes, and I'm speaking generally here, there's a tendency to attribute disagreement, racism, rather than engaging with the actual policy substance." "I see," Crockett nodded. "And when you say sometimes, are you referring to specific instances? Because as someone who spent years in courtrooms dealing with actual policy substance, I'm curious about these examples you have in mind." Audience was quiet now, sensing the tension building. Mahar's usual confident demeanor flickered for just a moment. "Well, I don't want to call out specific people." "Oh, but you already did," Crockett interrupted gently. "You specifically mentioned young representatives from urban districts. That's a pretty specific demographic, wouldn't you say?" Maher tried to regain control of the conversation. "Look, I'm just saying that sometimes legitimate policy disagreements get characterized as racist when they're really not. I think we can have honest conversations about crime policy, for instance, without someone immediately playing the race card." The phrase "playing the race card" hung in the air like a challenge. Crockett's expression didn't change, but anyone watching closely could see her jaw tighten slightly. "The race card," she repeated slowly. "That's an interesting phrase, Bill. Tell me, when someone points out actual racial disparities in our criminal justice system, disparities that are documented by data from your own government agencies, what would you call that?" "I'd call it bringing up relevant facts," Maher said, clearly not seeing where she was heading. "Exactly," Crockett said, leaning forward slightly. "So when I mention that Black Americans are incarcerated at roughly 5 times the rate of white Americans for the same crimes, according to federal statistics, am I playing the race card, or am I bringing up relevant facts?" Maher paused, realizing he walked into something. "Well, those are statistics, right? Facts, data, evidence." Crockett's voice remained calm, but her words carried increasing weight. "So, help me understand, Bill. When exactly does citing documented evidence become playing the race card? Is there a specific threshold, a particular tone I should avoid? Should I ask permission before mentioning racial disparities that affect my constituents?" The audience was fully engaged now, some leaning forward, their seats. This wasn't the usual back and forth they expected from these interviews. Maher, known for his quick wit and ability to control conversations, was clearly struggling to regain his footing. "I'm not saying you can't mention racial disparities," he said, his voice slightly defensive. "I'm talking about when everything becomes about race, even when it might not be." "Everything," Crockett repeated. "That's another interesting word choice. Can you give me an example of when I've made everything about race inappropriately?" Maher looked uncomfortable. "Well, I'm not specifically talking about you personally, but you introduced me as someone from an urban district right after a monologue about politicians supposedly call everything racist. So either you were talking about me personally, or you were making assumptions about me based on where I represent. Which is it?" The trap was now fully visible to everyone in the studio. Maher had painted himself into a corner with his own words, and Crockett was systematically closing off his escape routes. In the control room, producers were frantically whispering to each other. This wasn't going according to their usual script. The show's executive producer, a veteran of decades in television, had never seen anything quite like this unfold in real time. Their guest wasn't just defending herself. She was systematically dismantling their host's credibility, using his own words against him. The social media manager, monitoring online reactions in real time, was watching the engagement numbers spike beyond anything they'd seen before. Comments were flooding in faster than the moderation team could handle them. Some viewers were praising Crockett's intelligence and preparation. Others were expressing shock at seeing their familiar host so thoroughly outmaneuvered. "Should we go to commercial?" whispered one producer to another. But the executive producer shook his head. Whatever was happening, it was television gold. The kind of unscripted moment that would be talked about for years. They had to let it play out. Meanwhile, in the green room where potential guests waited for future segments, a prominent political consultant was quietly taking notes on his phone. He recognized immediately that he was watching a master class in political communication that would be studied in campaign schools and media training programs across the country. The camera operators, veterans of countless political interviews, were making subtle adjustments to capture the full drama of the moment. They zoomed in on Maher's increasingly uncomfortable expressions, caught Crockett's composed confidence, and panned occasionally to audience members whose faces showed they understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The show's head writer, responsible for crafting Maher's usual sharp comebacks and witty responses, was sitting helplessly as his carefully prepared material became irrelevant. This wasn't a scripted exchange where clever one-liners would save the day. This was a systematic deconstruction, assumptions and stereotypes that required substantive responses Maher clearly wasn't prepared to give. Security personnel trained to handle disruptions from audience members or unexpected events found themselves in uncharted territory. There was no disruption to manage, no crisis to contain. Just a guest who was using intelligence and preparation to completely change the power dynamics of their host's own show. Maher attempted to deflect by changing the subject. "Look, let's talk about your criminal justice reform proposals. Some critics say they're too soft on crime, especially for violent offenses, but Crockett wasn't going to let him escape that easily. I'm happy to discuss policy, Bill, but first I think we should address what just happened here. You made some pretty serious implications about how politicians like me operate, and I think your audience deserves clarification." She turned slightly toward the audience, acknowledging them directly, "Because here's what I heard in your open monologue and your questions to me. You suggested that politicians from urban districts, and let's be honest about what that's code for, routinely cry racism instead of engaging in substantive policy discussions." Maher tried to interrupt, but Crockett continued smoothly. "You used the phrase playing the race card, which has a very specific history and meaning. And then you brought me on as an example of this supposed problem. So let's talk about that. I'm a former public defender who spent years in courtrooms before running for office." Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength. I've represented clients facing decades in prison, fought for police accountability measures, and worked on legislation that's reduced recidivism rates in Texas by the past 2 years. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small folder. I brought some statistics with me tonight because I believe in backing up my positions with facts. Would you like to see them? Maher, clearly uncomfortable with how the tables had turned, nodded reluctantly. Texas Department of Criminal Justice data shows that our evidence-based reform programs have saved taxpayers millions while reducing repeat offenses. The reforms I've advocated for are based on successful models from red states like Georgia and Texas, implemented by Republican governors. She set the folder on Maher's desk. These aren't emotional appeals, Bill. This is evidence-based policymaking. So when you suggest that politicians like me just play the race card instead of doing substantive work, what exactly are you basing that on? Maher reached for his usual deflection tactics. I'm not saying you specifically, but you are. Crockett interrupted, her tone still professional, but increasingly pointed. You brought me on this show immediately. After making those comments, you introduced me in a way that connected me to your opening monologue, so let me ask you directly, have you actually looked at my legislative record? Do you know what bills I've sponsored? Committees I serve on? What my background is? The silence stretched for several seconds, an eternity in television time. Maher's mouth opened and closed without producing words. His usual quick wit seemed to have completely abandoned him, leaving him looking exactly like what he was in this moment, unprepared and exposed. The camera operators trained to capture every nuance of these moments zoomed in slightly on both faces. Maher's expression cycled through confusion, embarrassment, and a growing realization that he was losing control of his own show. Crockett's face remained composed, patient, like a prosecutor who had just asked the question that would break open her entire case. In the control room, show's producers exchanged worried glances. They could see the social media metrics spiking in real time as clips. This exchange began circulating. The engagement numbers were through the roof, but not in the way they'd planned. This was supposed to be a standard political interview, not a master class in how to expose media bias. I'll take it as a no, Crockett said gently, her voice carrying just enough disappointment to make it sting. So, you made assumptions about my approach to politics based on what exactly? That's fact that I represent a diverse urban district. The fact that I'm a young black woman? Help me understand logic here, Bill, because I'm genuinely curious about how this works in your mind. Here's what I think happened. Crockett continued, her voice taking on the tone she'd used in closing arguments. You saw a young black congresswoman coming on your show, and you immediately assumed I would fit a stereotype you've created about politicians who look like me. You didn't research my background, my record, or my actual positions. You just figured I'd be another politician who plays the race card. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. But here's the irony, Bill. The only person who made this conversation about race is you. I came here to discuss criminal justice policy. You're the one who brought up urban politicians and playing the race card. So, who's really making everything about race here? Maher, visibly flustered, attempted damage control. Look, I think you're mischaracterizing what I said. Am I? Crockett pulled out her phone. Your producers sent me a transcript of your opening monologue. Would you like me to read it back to you? The color drained from Maher's face. He clearly hadn't expected her to come this prepared. Said, and I quote, they figured out the perfect political strategy. Just everything racist and watch your opponents scramble. What you then said, it was like having a trump card you can play anytime someone disagrees with your policies. Those are your exact words, Bill. Crockett leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed, but her gaze intense. So, let me ask you something, and I want a straight answer. When a black congresswoman cites documented racial disparities in the justice system, disparities that exist whether I mention them or not, do you consider that playing the race card? Maher stammered. Well, it depends on the context. No, it doesn't, Crockett said firmly. Either facts are facts, or they're not. Either documented evidence matters or it doesn't. You can't have it both ways. She turned to address the audience directly. This is exactly the problem we face in politics today. When people of color point out documented inequalities, accused of playing the race card. When we cite statistics, we're told we're making everything about race. When we bring evidence to support our positions, we're dismissed as emotional or divisive. But here's what I want everyone watching to understand, Crockett said, her voice rising slightly for the first time. I didn't bring race into this conversation. Bill did with his opening comments, his characterizations, and his assumptions about who I am and how I operate as a legislator. She gestured toward the audience, her movement deliberate, inclusive. Every person in this studio heard those opening remarks. You heard the coded language, the assumptions, the stereotypes dressed up as political commentary. And now you're seeing what happens when someone refuses to play along with that narrative. Looking directly at Maher, her gaze unwavering, she continued, you created a stereotype about urban politicians, and then tried to make me fit into it. When I didn't cooperate with your narrative, when I responded with facts and evidence, instead of getting defensive, you struggled to adjust because your entire approach was based on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. The audience was completely engaged now, some nodding along with her words. Several people in the front row were leaning forward, recognizing they were witnessing something unprecedented in the usually controlled environment of late-night television. This is exactly what happens to politicians of color across this country every single day. Crockett said, her lawyer's instincts taking over completely. We're expected to defend ourselves against stereotypes rather than discuss our actual work. We're supposed to prove we're not what people assume we are, instead of being evaluated on our merits, accomplishments. She pulled out her phone and held it up slightly. I have 30 legislation with my name on them. What 18 have become law? 3 have saved taxpayers over $60 million. But instead of discussing any of that, I'm here explaining why citing racial disparities isn't playing the race card. It's called doing my job. The conviction in her voice was building, but her tone remained professional, controlled. When I mentioned that Black Texans are 3 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession despite equal usage rates across racial lines, that's not an emotional appeal, that's data from the Texas Department of Public Safety. When I point out sentence disparities in our courts, I'm citing federal statistics, not grievances. Maher attempted one last deflection. I think you're being overly sensitive. Overly sensitive? Crockett repeated, shaking her head with a slight smile that didn't reach her eyes. There it is, the final piece of the puzzle. When a Black woman refuses to accept coded language and demands accountability, she's being overly sensitive. When she comes prepared with facts and responds intelligently to loaded questions, suddenly she's the problem. She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone she'd perfected in countless courtroom closing arguments. It's almost like you're reading from a script, Bill. First, make assumptions based on stereotypes. Then, when those assumptions are challenged with evidence, claim the person is being too emotional or too sensitive. It's a playbook as old as American politics itself. The studio had fallen completely silent except for the hum of cameras and lights. Even the production crew seemed frozen, recognizing they were capturing something that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. The studio audience, which had been silent throughout most of this exchange, began to murmur. Some people started clapping slowly. Then others joined in. The applause built gradually until it filled the studio. Maher sat behind his desk, his usual confident demeanor completely shattered. His face was flushed, his hands fidgeting with papers he wasn't reading. For perhaps the first time in his television career, he appeared genuinely speechless. Crockett sat calmly, watching him process what had just happened. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't got emotional, hadn't done any of the things his comments had implied she would do. Instead, she'd systematically dismantled his arguments using the very skills that had made her successful in courtrooms across Texas. As the commercial break hit, the tension in the studio was palpable. Maher slumped in his chair, staring at the desk while his producers huddled nearby, frantically whispering about damage control. The audience remained in their seats, many still processing what they'd just witnessed. Crockett used the break to check her phone where notifications were already flooding in. Her communications director, watching from the green room, gave her a thumbs up. They both knew this moment would define conversation about race and politics for weeks to come. When cameras rolled again, Maher attempted to salvage the interview by pivoting to policy discussions, but the damage was done. Every subsequent question felt hollow after what had just transpired. Crockett answered professionally, providing detailed policy positions that showcased exactly the kind of substantive engagement Maher had claimed she was incapable of. Within minutes of the first clips appearing online, social media platforms erupted. The hashtag Crockett destroys Maher began trending before the show even ended. Twitter users shared clips of the most devastating moments, particularly Crockett's systematic breakdown of Maher's assumptions and her final overly sensitive response. Progressive commentators hailed it as a masterclass in how to handle coded racism in media spaces. "This is what it looks like when someone comes prepared," tweeted one prominent activist. Crockett didn't just defend herself, she exposed the entire playbook these hosts use. The clip of Crockett asking, "Have you actually looked at my legislative record?" followed by Maher's stunned silence became an instant meme. Users paired it with screenshots from other political interviews where similar assumptions had been made about politicians of color. The contrast was stark. Here was someone who refused to play the expected role. Conservative voices were more divided in their responses. Some acknowledged Crockett's skill even while disagreeing with her politics. "I don't agree with her positions, but she absolutely demolished Maher," wrote one right-leaning commentator. "He walked right into that one. You have to respect the preparation and execution." Others tried to defend Maher, arguing that his comments had been taken out of context or misinterpreted, but these defenses gained little traction as more clips circulated, showing the full context of his opening monologue and subsequent questions. The most shared clip became Crockett's moment when she listed her legislative accomplishments. "I have 37 pieces of legislation with my name on them. 14 have become law. 3 have saved Texas taxpayers over $60 million. The stark contrast between her concrete achievements and Maher's vague assumptions resonated with viewers across the political spectrum. Political staffers, particularly those working for politicians of color, began sharing the clips with comments like, "This is required viewing," and "Study this response." Communication directors started using the exchange as a case study in how to handle loaded questions and coded language in media appearances. The phrase "overly sensitive" began trending separately, with users sharing examples of times when legitimate concerns raised by women and people of color had been dismissed with this exact language. The hashtag #OverlySensitive became a rallying cry, with people sharing stories of times they'd been told they were being too sensitive when pointing out discrimination or bias. Media outlets beyond American borders picked up the story within hours. Political commentators across different countries used the exchange as an example of how conversations about race and politics were evolving in American media. Several noted that Crockett's approach, methodical, evidence-based, and professionally delivered, represented a new model for how politicians could challenge media bias in real time. Television critics and media analysts immediately recognized the significance of what had occurred. This wasn't just another political disagreement on a talk show, it was a real-time example of how conversations about race play out in mainstream media spaces. Several prominent journalists pointed out how Maher's approach reflected broader problems in political commentary. The assumption that young black politicians are somehow less substantive or more likely to play the race card is exactly the kind of thinking Crockett exposed. wrote one media critic. Others noted how Crockett's legal background had prepared her perfectly for this moment. She treated this like a courtroom, building her case methodically and closing off escape routes. Maher never stood a chance once. She took control of the narrative. The aftermath extended far beyond television criticism. Democratic leaders quickly praised Crockett's performance, with several senior members tweeting their support. "This is the kind of voice party needs," wrote one veteran congresswoman. "Smart, prepared, and unafraid to out problematic behavior wherever it comes from." Republican responses were more muted, though some acknowledged her effectiveness even while disagreeing with her positions. The incident became a talking point in political strategy circles, with communications directors studying Crockett's approach for future reference. What happened between Crockett and Maher represented something larger than one television exchange. It became a case study in how coded language about race operates in supposedly progressive spaces, and how effectively that language can be challenged when someone comes prepared. Media literacy experts used the clip in workshops and classes, pointing out how Maher's language choices, urban politicians playing the race card overly sensitive, revealed assumptions about black political leaders that persist even among liberal commentators. In the days following the show, Maher attempted various forms of damage control, issued a statement saying his comments had been misinterpreted and that he had great respect for Crockett's work. The statement only drew more criticism for failing to address the specific problems she had identified. During his next show, Maher made oblique references to the controversy, suggesting that some people couldn't handle honest political discussion. But clips of those comments only reinforced the perception that he hadn't learned from the experience. Crockett, meanwhile, used the increased attention strategically. She appeared on several other programs over the following weeks, each time demonstrating the same combination of preparation and policy expertise that had made her MOR appearance so effective. She also used her increased profile to highlight the criminal justice reform work that had brought her on Maher's show in the first place. "This is why representation matters," she said in one interview. "When people make assumptions about what politicians like me are capable of, they're really making assumptions about the communities we represent." The Crockett-Maher exchange became a reference point for future discussions about race in political media. Other politicians, particularly younger Black and Latino representatives, began citing it as an example of how to respond to coded language and subtle bias. Media training programs started, including scenarios based on the exchange, teaching political figures how to identify and respond to similar situations. The incident became a case study in communication schools across the country. Scholars of media and politics quickly recognized the exchange as a significant moment. Several academic papers analyzed Crockett's rhetorical strategies, noting how she used Maher's own words against him while maintaining a professional demeanor throughout. Linguists pointed out how effectively she had decoded and challenged the racial subtext in phrases like urban politicians and playing the race card. Her approach became a model for how to address coded language in real time. Months later, the Crockett-Maher exchange continued to influence political and media conversations. It had demonstrated that the era of politicians passively accepting coded racial language, even from supposed allies, was ending. For young politicians of color, Crockett's performance became inspirational. Had shown that preparation, intelligence, and strategic thinking could effectively counter even experienced media figures who relied on outdated assumptions and stereotypes. For media figures, the incident served as a warning that audiences were becoming more sophisticated about identifying and rejecting coded language. The old playbook of making assumptions about politicians based on their demographics was no longer sustainable. The exchange raised important questions about the future of political discourse in America. If established media figures could no longer rely on coded language and subtle bias, how would political conversations evolve? Would other politicians follow Crockett's model of systematic evidence-based responses? The incident also highlighted the growing influence of younger politicians who had grown up in an era of social media awareness, media literacy. These leaders were less likely to accept traditional power dynamics and more willing to challenge problematic behavior in real time. What started as a routine political interview became a defining moment in conversations about race, media, and political discourse. Jasmine Crockett's systematic dismantling of Bill Maher's assumptions demonstrated that a new generation of political leaders was prepared to challenge coded language and demand accountability. Even for supposed allies, the exchange proved that intelligence, preparation, strategic thinking could effectively counter decades of media assumptions about Black political leaders. It showed that the old rules of political discourse, where certain figures could make coded comments without consequence, were changing. Most importantly, it demonstrated that when someone comes prepared with facts, evidence, and clear thinking, they can change the entire dynamic of how these conversations happen. Crockett didn't just defend herself. She exposed and challenged a broader pattern of thinking that affects how political discussions happen across America. The lesson for anyone watching was clear. Never underestimate someone based on assumptions about their background, age, or demographics. In a world where information travels instantly and audiences are increasingly sophisticated, the truth has a way of emerging, and those who rely on outdated stereotypes do so at their own risk. Those who enjoyed watching this incredible political moment unfold, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss these amazing exchanges that everyone will be talking about. Drop a comment below and let us know what you thought about how Congresswoman Crockett handled this situation. What other political figures do you think should watch and learn from her approach?